the system. So what you see is McCloskey is identifying a form of discussion and subjectivity that has an openness that creates wealth, but by not going into the sociological analysis of what creates that and then pressingly what maintains that, which I think is the missing variable in all this, that's the next step in the conversation. You could say that McCloskey gives us reason to think that a transformation, a dialectical transformation in subjectivity creates wealth. And then it's tied to speech, strongly tied to speech, following a Jonathan Rout's and Kindly Inquisitors, which shows that free speech goes a long way to creating ideas and testing ideas and so on and so forth, of which then changes the subject according to the frame of speech. So all of that, and then that makes sense because the dialectical subject is psychoanalytical, and psychoanalysis has a lot to do with speaking and desire and how desire is tied with speaking and all that. So if you're speaking about a frontier, then that creates a desire to cross it and to be the kind of subject who can cross it. So all of that is there, and it's all connected together. But then the question is, okay, well, how do you maintain a dialectical society? Well, that would mean if it's no longer found externally in a frontier, if it's no longer, if it's only so far been kind of an event that's sort of random and then goes away, kind of similar to democracy following Sheldon Wolin, then we have to become intentional about something that so far has been a kind of unprecedented, almost uncontrollable event. And it's going to have a lot to do with turning more inward to the lack that is ontological lack, not a lack that is found in the world externally, like according to a frontier or an ocean you haven't crossed. Or, a belief in, if people don't believe in God in the same way, that, if it's not a religious society, that provides a lack, apophatic lack, or different things. Well, if you're not going to have all of that, then this is where it will require a role of lack in the society.
Yeah, I think that was all really good. I was thinking to myself, well, is there there's kind of can be seen to be a frontier in terms of space and like going to Mars and all that.
Yeah, that's what people are trying.
But do you think it's kind of different because your average person don't got a rocket? I mean, it's not like because in the past you could just, and yes, there were risks with this because a lot of times it could mean taking over somebody else's land, that was already there. It was a frontier to you, it was just somebody else's home. But this idea of like you could literally just get your wagon and go. You'd have to prepare and you'd have to know how to hunt, you'd have to know how to survive. But so now we both don't we don't really need, quote unquote, need those skills as much anymore. We also don't, even if you had a car, you would still have the reliance of gas and the money and all of that. So it's like there's something that feels less like you can do this, or go out and explore. I guess what I mean to say is it's funny, the frontier, it's interesting to think about that as a concept and how the presence of that impacts society, because in a sense some unexplored woods is a frontier to you, right? So, and could that be resurrected, that sense of the concept, by just sort of, I don't know, just sort of saying I'm going to learn some skills and go through.
I think that, what you're getting at...
Go hiking and, go through the forest and learn to fish. I don't know.
A phrase that someone like a tailor will talk about is enchantment. How do you bring enchantment back to reality, right? So the frontier, there's a few things. A lot of people are indeed talking about going to Mars to bring back a frontier that motivates people to figure out problems they otherwise would not solve, and so on and so on. It can definitely have that function. One of the issues that may make it less effective, though, is that we've already seen photographs of Mars before we go there. So there's less surprise. There's generally a very strong sense of what you're going to find before you get there. Also, a frontier out west for people that still believe in miracles, magic, maybe folklore, there's a kind of sense of the frontier having an enchantment to it. That also probably impacts the ability of the frontier to create openness, the existence of myth. There are people, you could argue that this is where Carl Hayden Smith or other people are talking about psychedelics as being what can provide the new frontier. in all honesty, something like psychedelics has probably a better chance than going to Mars because it is so mysterious.
Yeah, like you can't get pictures of what a psychedelic experience would be like. I mean, you can have
and even if you can, you can't really get it. But you can have a sense of what going to Mars would be like. It would be terrible. Also, going to Mars, it would be awful.
Sorry, really.
Go on.
Go on. Well, there's this like little teeny tiny short film that I saw, which was like a Despicable Me sort of like spin-off thingy bobber. But one of the villains basically is like stuck on the moon, and then he like won't make friends with the minions, so he could have easily gotten help from them and like gone back to the Earth.
That's funny.
But he he refuses, because he doesn't refuse the help. He just treats them badly, so he misses his opportunity to be helped by them.
That's funny.
Long story short, he like ends up, he's like, that's right, I've got rockets. So he like blasts himself off, and then he lands on Mars. And then like, he meets an alien, and he's kind of a jerk to the alien. So, but the alien and like meets up with other minions, and they're having a little party, and then they have their little spaceship to get back. And he's like, no.
That's funny. Oh yeah, well, one, that's perfect. That explains it. And so,
That's it.
I mean, the issue is also going to Mars at this point, you'd have to turn around and come back. Like a key to the frontier is that you stay.
Could establish a life.
You could establish a new life. So that, I think, are the details of the difference between those frontiers that are a big deal. Now, it is very possible, like, this is where, if one wants to be bullish on AI may allow forms of interstellar travel and exploration that actually do bring a bit of, mystery to reality. Like, if you could really dimensionally travel or travel into deep space and find planets like Earth or something, that could do it. But if we're talking about going to a rock called Mars, it's going to be difficult. Now, you could argue, but that's a necessary step along the way. That's fair. It could be.
Then it's still, like I said already, it's like the average person can't do that.
Yeah, it's not going to sustain.
Millions. You need a bunch of money to go to Mars. You know what I'm saying? Like, and
where the
for
average
what?
person
And
can
for
get
what?
in a
It's
wagon.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, an average person could. I mean, sure, you'd need some certain resources, but it was far more, likely that you could at least, do that. Like, you could venture, and there's a little bit more of a sense of ability, like in the Illichian sense, right? Like, the people weren't as disabled with their capacity, and it was simpler. It was simpler. I mean, it wasn't necessarily going to be easier. It was probably way harder, but it was simpler, you know?
Well, I mean, another issue is that point you're making about the average person needing to have access to the frontier. I mean, there's a way in which when religions had things like prayer, there was a sense where the average person had contact with God.
With this
certainly
spiritual frontier.
Yes, and so there's a frontier there that people have access to that creates a dialectic, that creates an openness of the subject. And this is where someone like McCloskey, the Reform, the Protestant Reformation, is really a big part of the average person seeing possibilities, because they themselves then, they have access to God. So what can't they do? Why couldn't they invent steam engines? Why couldn't they go out west, right? They have a personal relation. They have like a direct connection with God. And so there's a way in which the breakup of the centralization of connection of God to the magistrate, to the layman, like we're the average person, that was a very empowering thing.
Yeah.
Of which then enabled them to take seriously their ability to do things that otherwise seemed impossible to do, or that they would risk coming in conflict with the magistrate. Now, going back to Hunter, the danger is then, because you say, well, I as an individual, as a Christian, God's with me so I can do anything, you then fall into the evangelical trap of not having cultural connection, and that's where you go too far on the side of the layman and not enough to the magistrate, right? Mm-hmm. And this is where, when Cadell is talking about the dialectic between, discourse and rhetoric, you could look at it this way. Like, if you have a rhetoric in the sense of this Protestant sort of separating freedom of the individual to connect with God, they may not connect or relate to places of cultural influence. Therefore, they're not able to make a cultural impact or different things. But again, if you could just go out west and make your own way, who cares if you have contact with the government or the magistrate? Because you're going to just make your own society, right? Your own people. But now, that sort of rugged individual who can change the world without connections to the discourse at all, is going to end up not culturally relevant. Now, again, it's understandable to avoid the discourse because, as the book talks about, the discourse runs the risk of habituating you into Kafka or Foucault. But then if you don't take that risk at all because you're completely isolated and don't want to be influenced by the cultural discourse, then you're not going to be in a place of being able to influence the culture, right? You'll have a different way of speaking, a different way of thinking, but it won't be able to change the culture. So the very thing then that creates the possibility of this great enrichment can also overfit into being what results in people not being connected with cultural influence, like not being connected with institutions because they don't think they need them because they have a personal connection with God. And so that, if we were to put it that way, the personal connection with God that to some degree comes out of Protestantism is precisely what empowers the individual to dialectically think of new ways of life, which then compels them to create wealth and invent and go out west. But that very drive can then individuate them away from places of cultural influence, and thus they can't have the faithful presence. But this is where, and then those very institutions may close themselves off to access to people who don't accept the discourse as they frame it, and then you get an enclosure there that you need access to change the culture. And this is where the internet and Zoom and the liminal web come to play, because they allow a way to have cultural reach and cultural influence without necessarily passing the test of the gatekeepers who won't let you through unless you absorb the discourse to the point of enclosure.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it, and interesting. I mean, obviously a lot changes from the pioneer to the modern evangelical, but I think everything you said is really important. With what you're saying, and that point about not having, not staying in a faithful presence of influence, like I think about the founding fathers, for example, right? Like, okay, if they had, if maybe they felt like they tried. They're like, we've tried, or I don't know, maybe they were impatient, who knows? But like they got to the point where they said, no, like we're just gonna go, we're gonna go create something ourselves. But I wonder if the creation element is not as there for the modern, because everything's so established. There's
you're
there's a
disabled.
power grid. There's this. There's grocery stores.
Yeah.
So there was a greater dialectic between the talking and doing.
Yes.
For the pioneer.
Yes.
And again, there are risks with westward expansion in terms of like this being kind of a feeling of like this is our divine providence, but really it could be like taking over other people's land. There's issues with that, but generally speaking, it kind of has this sentiment of we can do something, and we are allowed to do something because we have that kind of divine power with us, right, going forth with us. And also people themselves were sometimes fleeing their own persecution, so it wasn't always just like they were trying to oppress other people. They didn't always know other people were there. It's just a great unknown. Sure. But anyways, I do think that's another tricky thing, because then you just, technology already is established, and technology in general, in my opinion, is like gravitates toward being not dialectical. It can be
absolutely, because it's disabled,
but it generally tends toward that.
Well, I mean, the disablement is a huge part of it, because in the past, the chains of ideas was not so likely to separate people from doing, whereas like conversation and doing were more tied, whereas today it's easy to talk and not do. And then Ivan Illich will say, and you're also disabled from doing anything, by technology, by the society. You don't know how to hunt because you go to the store to get food, right? So there's a disablement. And that, it's also like to go back to that aesthetic stuff, like if you're habituated to value things according to the commodity form, looking at Marx, then you are disabled from valuing, you are in that come to be disabled from valuing things in different ways. Mm-hmm. And a big part of like rhetoric, as McCloskey talks about it, or we could say voicecraft, because that's the term we more so use going into the future, is that a lot of voicecraft is the capacity to coordinate, to engage in internal coordination of value, as Anthony talks about, like to engage in the ability to value things in different ways. But that requires a certain enablement to see value in things beyond just the commodity form, to believe that even if Faulkner won't get you a job, there's a value here, even if it's hard to explain. Well, that requires facing an anxiety. That requires being enabled to emotionally stand by a decision to do something, even if everyone else thinks you're dumb, which then would require you to have gained the thoughts to sustain yourself in that decision.
Yeah.
So there's a certain enablement that's required there to value things beyond simply to the degree that gets you paid, or example. So disablement and enablement are a big part of this, but where does enablement start? In the quotidian. That's the issue. Like, that's why I like the idea of, the liminal web as a grassroots movement that's really starting as a certain enablement and permissionary of what you can do at home. Yeah, you can read Hegel at home. Yep. You don't have to be a philosophy. You can do that. You can join a conversation online that's not going to get you a degree because you enjoy learning. You see value in learning for learning's sake. There's a certain permissionariness.
Yeah.
Like, it is like, one of the things the liminal web does, if we just use that phrase, liminal web, the liminal web says to people, it shows people that it's okay to learn for learning's sake.
Yes.
Like, colleges said that all the time. No one believed it. Because it was in the formulating aesthetic of getting certification.
Yep.
So they informed you that learning for learning's sake was great, but you weren't formulated to believe learning for learning's sake was great.
Yeah. No, that's great, and I think that's why the inform versus form is a great distinction to highlight and see how that plays out. So the thing is, I was thinking about, well, I took a lot of classes because I was like just genuinely wanted to learn, right? But would I have taken them if I wasn't going to get a degree? Or
exactly.
Would I have taken them if it, this is the thing. Also, the liminal space even provides, which can be challenging because there's a lot of like financial questions around sustainability of it. But the fact that people will be willing to pay for something, but they won't be getting a degree is huge. Like, it's crazy.
It's a permissionary. It gives you permission to do that, as
right.
Ebert talks about.
And also a recognition of value, where you say, I actually will learn more about what I want to learn about offline. Like, not online, not in the institutional space. And
Absolutely.
I think too, the other thing, even if I did have a gusto and like I just want to learn this, in my years of like, let's say college,
without others. Without other people around you.
And there were serious limitations to certain things where I was because I remember like starting out really wanting to study virology with a really particular question in mind. I had to take like so many other types of courses before I could even get there that I mean, for good or for bad, maybe it's like I'm a quitter. I'm not. I don't see myself as a quitter generally. Like, I try to be persevere with stuff. But I didn't end up carrying on with that course in trajectory of sciences because it just was honestly rather disheartening. Like, the structure of it, you had like these three or four multiple choice questions per year, and they had like 5 questions on them. That's hard on your grade because there's a lot of one question wrong and your grade's already reduced quite a bit. Anyways, the point of the matter is like the other challenge. I know that it's there for a reason, that these like kind of little hurdles and things you have to hoops you have to jump through to get to what you actually want to study. But it's like I didn't always get to just jump into what I really wanted to study, because what I really wanted to study required me to take genetics, this, that, and the other before I could even get there. And I'm like, I don't understand why exactly. I mean, okay, I'll do it, but like how did this exactly relate? Like, if it could have just been the jumping in directly to that, which the online provides you a way to do that. Do you want to understand on a chemical level how viruses work? You can go look that up right now. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's something quite crazy about that ability. Like, yes, that access has its risks, but there's also this radical ability to actually do it from and from your home, like if you want to, or even if you don't have internet at a cafe. Like, it's so I guess I'm just trying to get a little self-skeptical, because generally speaking I felt like I was taking things because I just wanted to learn. But the other thing, last point, did it teach me a form, like an actual form of being that would do that apart from that? No, not
that's
necessarily.
The key. Like,
not necessarily.
informed means not formed. You get informed, but that doesn't mean you're formed.
Yeah.
Well, just think about what people do after college. They're interested in taking classes in college, and right after they stop reading. Like they're not like, so
and
it doesn't
I can't tell you how
carry.
many times people be like, oh, I really want to learn Japanese, and then be like, but I can't, like, I'm not like in a class, so I don't really feel the same motivation to like make myself
Without
do this,
social
you know?
support. Well, the other issue is if you try to read Hegel on your own without a teacher or a master, then you get astray and you have no idea where to start. So you need a teacher, but where do you find a teacher outside the university system? So there's a bunch of problems. There's a bunch of logistical problems, let's put it that, sociological and logistical problems that must be addressed for learning's sake. Basically, right now, you could argue for the first time in history, it is literally possible to learn for learning's sake because you have the technological infrastructure to make that possible, which means that people can be formed to value learning for learning's sake for its own end.
In mass, I think, for sure.
In mass?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, socially, yes, there were always bubbles and instances, but this is the rhetoric point. It was not sustainable. This is what we say. Like what McCloskey is describing
that's fair.
is an
That's good.
explosion of people that basically believe in learning for learning's sake, or inventing for inventing's sake, or trying for trying's sake. Like it's a explosion of intrinsic motivation.
Yeah.
And then it goes away. Because there were not the conditions to form it.
Say you had somebody who's like, I just want to learn how to knit and like how to knit clothes. They had that ability to do that maybe when they were still a teenager, but then they got a job and they were like, they rarely have time to do that. So it's like because of market forces or whatever. So it's like it's not sustainable in the sense that you end up hitting a wall sometimes with your capacity and your time. And I'm not saying somebody still can't do it if they really want to, they'll find a way. But it's harder. It gets a lot harder and it's not as sustainable.
Well, what ends up happening is so you don't have time to knit. But if you at least had communities to encourage you in other areas of intrinsic motivation, then when you do get time to knit again, back when you're 20 years later, when you're 50, you might actually do it. But if between 35 and 55, you fall into a discouragement because you weren't able to knit and there was no other activities that were intrinsically motivated to sustain you or communities to show you the possibility of any moment jumping back into intrinsic motivation, then the likelihood of you ever coming back around to knitting is very, very low. Whereas even if you can't do knitting now, just being in an ethos or communities of people who do things for their own sake radically increases the probability that you will actually come back because you're being socialized differently according to a different kind of motivation that values for its own sake.
Yeah, and I think you might even pick it up sooner, right? Like then when you're in your 50s, because maybe because knitting's a kind of a weird example because there was a time when it was like a necessity. You had to knit to get to have a sweater, even if you wanted a sweater. But like now you don't really need a knit, right? So it's like that's another thing where a lot of things that people could intrinsically learn, they're like, why? I don't understand why. And then it was like, well, you'll get a degree or you can make money from it, right? But now we're in a time where it's like there's a lot more unleashing of you won't necessarily get a degree and you won't necessarily be able to earn money from this, but you will be able to learn and expand your own horizons and expand your own selfhood. And I think that's when you're acculturated to that with like certain like kind of groups or communities of that, you start to be like, oh, that time I didn't think I had for knitting, I was kind of scrolling on Facebook or something. I could go back to doing that, and I can. I think I really appreciate that because I see some other people around me who are pursuing it too, and that's encouraging and inspiring.
Yeah, because it socializes people to value things for their own sake, and that is the grassroots movement of the liminal web. That is 100%. A transformation of logic, not just content. That is a transformation of how people are formed and formulate themselves, which then has them motivated in different ways, makes them act like different kinds of subjects, and this is where you start to have significant changes in the society, because it's on the logic level. It's on the very way people value use their time, think about things, and here's also the issue. It is not merely for the sake of what's going to climb my ladder at how am I going to improve my position at work. You're not trying to optimize in a manner to get a better career path because that's still in the commodity form. No, this is in a way completely apathetic. Like you're doing it for its own sake. You believe that there is something in it that's for its own sake. Therefore, there's a lack, but that lack is a beauty. Therefore, it's a dialectical materialism.
Yeah.
The weird thing, now this is where belonging again too has to get into. The weird thing about capital is it works precisely by making a thing not what it is. This pen is worth $1. So it's an AB kind of thing, and yet it works by making you forget the AB. Like it becomes an equal sign. It's not that a pen, it equals $1, not merely moves into being $1. So there's some weird ways where capital works precisely by plugging into our analogous working brains. Like capital works by plugging into our AB brains, that then makes us forget we're AB. We think we're AA, and that's where the self-effacement sets in, because we come to forget what we really are. Yeah. So there's a tricky move there. And basically, the more you're able to value things for yourself, the more you're able to identify the AB-ness that actually is what makes all sociology possible, all economics, all societies possible. But that works by making you forget about that AB. Like, that's the weird thing. Like, they all work by habituating you out of a conscious recognition of the AB, of the dialectical activity that's going on. But it's only possible for that forgetting to occur because you're dialectical. That's what's really weird. Like, the only way that you can be convinced that an abstraction is concrete is if you're capable of thinking according to abstraction, which should be a revelation that, hey, you're dialectical. But instead, we literally forget all of the abstractions all around us. We treat words like things. We treat prices as if things are a dollar. We come to metaphysically examine the world in a manner where we think the metaphysical dimensions are material, like purely physical. So there's a weird amnesia that's occurring where we lose the capacity to see what's going on right in front of us, that sociology requires in order to get us to operate according to the discourse, in the Kafka sense, the value form that it has a monopoly on, that it's training us according to. And so that's kind of a weird thing that's going on. Does that make sense? Because that's a tricky move that Belonging Again 2.2 wants to talk about.
Can you just trace that out one more time?
So when I look at this cloth, this shirt, it's red.
Well,
I come to where I'm so used to calling it a shirt that I forget that the mental construct of shirt is actually a mental construct.
Right.
That this is not, in a sense, a shirt.
Right.
It's a phenomenon that I refer to as shirt.
Yeah.
The only reason, though, I am able to refer to this as shirt is because my brain works analogously, dialectically. It can make the material and the idea, it can move between the two, dialectically. But it comes to do it so quickly that I actually lose sight of the dialectical activity that occurs in me calling this a shirt.
Right. No, I did understand that. I was wondering how that was, you were relating that to, maybe I just missed something because I was folding a shirt, but like, I'm so sorry. But we were talking about the college and like the way of learning and how you experience, you know, then you're like, well, did it form me to do that outside of it? How, was there
college
something
does
between
not,
there that I missed?
No, college does not teach you because it's according to the logic of capital. College does not teach you or form you to be the kind of subject who can realize that when you call this a shirt, there's a dialectic going on. When you learn for yourself, that means you have to decide this shirt has value for yourself.
I see.
So you're adding an idea to
like,
it.
In the form, it's dialectical.
Yes.
Whereas the current form of most institutional learning is this. We will tell you this has value.
Yes. Yes.
It's bestow-centrism.
Yes.
Right? It's like, so in that way, you are to a degree, because that's just human. You can't like not actually think of things dialectically, right?
Yes.
But you forget you're doing that.
Yes.
In that form. So then
yes.
to reformulate or to,
yes.
I don't know, form for the first time or something like that is to kind of actually engage in the form of the dialecticism or like
yes.
the dialecticized.
To own it.
Right.
To own what you've always been doing.
Yeah. That's fair. Okay, good.
And
I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry, because it is really weird. It's like the reason why there's hope and why this address is spreadable, because it involves a realization of something that everyone is already doing.
Yeah.
That's why there's hope. Because if it was a learning of something you didn't have,
right.
well, then you would have to spread the message, spread the gospel, right. And that could be totalitarian.
Right.
And if it was a creation, it could be totalitarian.
Right.
But if it's a realization within people of something they already do,
yep.
then it is theoretically scalable. Even if for some reason you fail, it's not necessarily going to fail.
Right.
There's theoretically the possibility of spreading this realization.
Yeah.
The question is, what would the incubator be? What would the grassroots movement be?
Right.
What would the aesthetic be?
Right.
Well, the liminal web. The liminal web is actually an aesthetic showing you what learning for yourself looks like.
Right.
Like, everyone has always talked about learning for learning's sake and reading because you care about it, but there's never been the possibility of a sociological aesthetic to show you that, and thus give you permission to do that.
You get, sorry, really quick. I mean, the one thing that comes to mind in terms of people doing this already is like when people say, well, when I retire, I'm going to go back to school for like this thing, or I'm over 60, so I can go to classes for free at the university. I can't wait to start studying physics. I mean, you know what I mean? You hear it then, but it's not necessarily like there's not the permission before that.
And 90% of the time, people are trained out of the ability to go back.
That's even rare.
But like nobody goes back. Very few. Like the great, the Mr. Right, at the Jeff Society. I mean, so, it's extremely rare. And it's extremely rare for people to pick up hobbies later on. And unfortunately, most hobbies that people pick up, if they go back in the 60s, tend to fall within the commodity form of what capitalism, the injunction to enjoy. Traveling, eating, stuff, which are not bad, but they're not necessarily... Most people, when they retire, do the things that the society tells them they ought to do when they retire. It's not according to their own values. Of course, we're not saying that's always the case, but it more so falls into the script of what is expected of someone when they're retired.
Yeah, I was just kind of bringing that up as an example of like, it's true. I guess I brought that up because it's like, it's something that's within people because you see it in little glimmers, right? But now there's like a greater permission for that with the liminal, with the liminal web.
Yeah, that's correct. And so if you don't, you can talk about learning for learning's sake all day long. You can talk about democracy all day long, the exchange of ideas. You can talk about creativity all day long, but if there is not people seeing it, then they're not going to do it. Like if you don't have that aesthetic, if people don't, and if they don't have the social support, like if you don't have the social support, if you can't read Hegel and find other people that have read Hegel to talk about it, then you're not going to do it. Or if you do it, you'll be very rare. And if you do it and you go down the rabbit hole of a bad interpretation, there will be no correction. So you'll end up siloed in your own rhetoric. And that's what Cadell was pointing at. Your own your own private discourse. And that can be a problem. And so you've got to have the social structure.
Yeah, I mean, just to push back a little bit, not that I don't agree, I do agree, but what's the aesthetic of the liminal web? Because it's and Jochen brought this up at the net one time, like because I think you're right. I think people need to be able to see it and be able to say, oh, you can do this? Oh, cool, right? I think that in a way people kind of got that permission a little bit with YouTube, where there's like, oh, I see that there's somebody teaching on Hegel, but they're not in a university. Okay, so we're starting to see this thing that looks different. So I get it to a degree, but if you go on TikTok, you're not going to see it right there.
No, this is why we emphasize Zoom.
Sure, but like, what's the avenue for people to see it?
On Zoom, you see not just people teaching on Hegel, but talking about Hegel.
No, but I mean, but where do people in the public just see this? They have to want it. They have to want to step into that space. They can. It's that they are. There's no gatekeeping really.
Well, right now they're seeing it on podcasts. Like
sure,
it's spreading, like long form podcasts. And
that's where I think YouTube is actually probably the best public avenue for it to be seen.
So Zoom allows the possibility of everyday people to jump on a call and have a philosophical discussion, which you see people doing, and then you say, "Wow, I could do that too." It is possible. Yeah. People have seen on YouTube. Obviously Jordan Peterson is a big example. Rogan, the possibility of learning outside the newsroom, the media that nobody trusts. They've seen long-form discussion. Grassroots movements are slow and gradual. Yeah. They follow an exponential curve. Very limited number of people, very limited number of people, lots and lots and lots. And that's how it spreads. And more people are seeing it, and it gradually enters the discourse, and this goes back to faithful presence. It takes 30 years. But now it seems like it takes 5 years. That's where we're saying there seems to be an acceleration, where these sociological paradigm intellectual shifts that before were 30 years may now be 5 to 10 years because of the rate of information traveling. And so I think people they hear about podcasts, about it, just gets into the cultural air. Then the next level from the Joe Rogan is basically seeing things like the liminal, like philosophy portal, or seeing communities forming that are not just a single guest, another guest, but communities of interaction that are like the long form podcasts, but also different. They're more communal. they're not just about listens or the attention economy. They're instead of gaining attention, you're trying to uplift awareness, which is analogously like the form of long form podcast, but it is also different. And it has to go that way because the only way you bring about new form is through a gradual bridge of likeness.
Right.
Like a gradual simile process where we say, okay, so long form podcast is like the Joe Riley or whatever debate that used to come on at 8 p.m. Okay, but it's different in that it's longer and it seems to be more philosophical. Oh, so it's kind of like debate, media plus college. That's interesting, but then it doesn't really fit into a college kind of exchange. It's more like a high-level discourse. Okay, they're mentioning a bunch of names like Young. Who is Young? Mark? Okay, that's interesting. Maybe I should go read those people. These people are talking about those people. So that means my neighbors have heard about Young because Peterson talks about Young. So if I read Young, my neighbor would now understand what I was doing or that the person I was reading existed or had cultural clout. Oh, who are these people on YouTube? Oh, wow, they're having like a philosophical discussion.
Right.
Oh, that's kind of like the long form, but now it's not celebrity-based. It's just regular people who are now forming initiatives to read. Oh, wow, I guess I could do it. You see how it gradually forms.
Well, and this kind of, this is why there's a lot of people like, I'm going to start a podcast, right? Like, there can be a lot of people say that and then they like do 3 episodes and they don't continue. And I'm not going to judge it. I'm just saying like, there's the thought of what that means, and then there's a real investment of what that means.
Yes.
And then depending on how much they're really wanting to do that, and I get it, there are also real costs to that.
Sure.
There's real time constraints, so I get it, I really do. But I'm just saying that the fact that even the fact even that people will say such a thing, and that's becoming so much more common, it means that it's in the social consciousness to even think that's a possibility.
Yes.
And that you would want to do such a thing.
Yes.
Why? Right?
Yes.
Like, are you earning anything?
The social
imagination
is changing.
We're just learning. Like, you got a lot of these like topical podcasts, or like, motherhood and wellness, or motherhood and whatever. I mean, whatever is finance and small business or whatever. And you get like these podcasts around these topical things, and it's like, oh, they just want to like learn together and share stuff they've learned and bring on people in and out of the institutions who can share on this topic too. So
the social imagination is changing.
Exactly.
And basically the argument, the only way to move into a different logic outside the logic of capital, referencing Mark, a dialectical logic that is going to be through a change in the social imagination. To change the social imagination, people need to see something different that then enables them, gives them permission to do the same. The new value form has to be based on learning for learning's sake, because it has to be intrinsically motivated. It has to be like Nietzsche's child that is choosing to value something by their own decision. So there's a value of your own making there that you are then making, which then allows you to make visible the analogous judgment that makes all valuation possible that society always had operating and they just made you forget in the capital form, that in realizing you then transform the logic you operate, and that then changes the world.
Yeah.
Because the world is changed by logical shifts.
Yeah.
And learning for learning's sake entails a changing and a conditioning of the subject to value in a different way. And in valuing in a different way, well, then you start asking, what is my logical reason for this value?
Yeah.
And you find that AA logic won't do.
Yeah.
You find that a dialectical logic is required.
Yeah.
And then you find you also have to have the courage and character to stand by that judgment.
Yeah.
And so the liminal web then functions to permit people and to show people and to enable people versus disable people with the possibility of actually learning for learning's sake.
Yeah.
And that is a grassroots movement that changes the social imagination, that in so doing can change how the economy, politics, community, and everything forms.
Yeah.
But it has to be on that level, because you're not going to change the social imagination by passing a law. Yeah, and so social imagination, this is where perhaps there is a unique capacity today to blend the faithful presence with the quotidian, with connections, with places of changing capital resource that was not possible before.
Yeah.
And so this is where, again, we could maybe look in the past and people marching on Washington or passing laws and kind of be like, oh, that's not the right approach. Well, maybe historically it was.
Yeah.
But now, Studebaker talks about the way is shut, right? Like the involvement in government, there's a way in which the way is shut. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Well, the hour of Minerva flies, and that's the beginning of something, as Terence Blake was saying with Cadell. Like, the way is shut is precisely because we don't need that way.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I was kind of, in our book club talk, I was trying to get, I was kind of hinting at that or saying that in other words, where it's almost like, it's not as if you never resort to law or policy change. You may need to, and I think it's smart to think through that, because you can criticize stuff all day long, but what's your idea, right? But you also suspend that judgment because there's actually could be another avenue opening up.
Yes.
Which actually bypasses that. Like, if it's some sort of monopoly, well, guess what? If the internet really does afford a type of creative destruction.
Yes.
Right now. And it's something that's kind of like, it's rolling. Like, people are noticing. Like, they will assess for themselves, in terms of, like, the quality of a lecture, the quality of X, Y, or Z.
Well, if so much rides now, as many of the thinkers of the 20th century talked about, on the structure of rationality itself, on the structure of human thought, on logic itself, then the answer can't just be changing laws. Because the laws are reifying whatever logical structure is there, right? Like, you have to change the way people think, like, on a very structural level. You have to introduce, like we talk about the truism and the rational, you have to make them realize there's a distinction between the non-rational and the rational, which is ultimately the realization of a need of a value choice. Because you have to choose a truth which will organize your rationality. Your rationality can't do that truth for you. That's another way to describe the revelation of the analogous structure of human subjectivity as AB, not AA. Well, that is what you need to change, that logical structure. And that changes if people learn for learning's sake.
Yeah. Because
that means they're valuing for their own self, like, because they themselves value it. But you see, here's the rub. Humans are not isolated individuals. So we can't value things for ourselves without community. And that's the kind of weird middle zone between a kind of hard, the collective exists, not the individual exists, not the collective. The problem is we've not been able to think about learning for learning's sake because we haven't had communities of learning for learning's sake. That is what is now possible outside of college.
Yeah.
It used to be possible in college, the monastery, but this was limited and it was an inefficient coordination system because then only people who moved to Oxford or who lived around Oxford could do it. Well, now we need a global transformation of subjectivity. So that's not gonna work because wherever you have a limited reach, because it's based on geography, by definition will only ever reach a minority. Well, if you have the world under the logic of global capitalism, AA, we could just say, then you have to have the globe, everyone's logic, the majority, maybe not everyone, but a critical mass of people, their logical structure has to shift. And that's going to involve something apathetic, something where people are choosing their own values for their values' sake. Well, is that even possible without learning for learning's sake, without like valuing things, without figuring things out for the sake of figuring things out? It would seem as if all selecting your own values requires some sort of learning for your own values, for your self-learning. It seems like it has to have some autodidactic character to it. And if that is so, then people are only going to be able to engage in this logical transformation if they see examples of communities of people learning for learning's sake, which is communities of intrinsic motivation.
Yeah.
The more and more people see that, and the more and more people form these different communities and value things for their own sake, then the more you could have a change in logic.
Yeah.
And I do think learning here, this is where with the liminal web being philosophical, there may be something unique about philosophy and talking in this. Because if it's communities of bowling or communities of rock climbing, I think that's a step in the right direction where you value rock climbing for its own sake, but you're not necessarily going into the realm of discussing the contours of subjectivity in itself, right? Now, I think philosophers who don't do rock climbing is going to be problematic. So this is where something like where Viveki talks about serious play is a big deal. Where you see philosophers and intellectuals also doing middle-class jobs, or also doing boxing, or also doing things. But that in of itself is another aesthetic that you're not used to. Whoa, I thought philosophers were old guys at college and weird vests who don't go out, right? Tweet suits. So seeing the philosopher who is also engaged in serious play, or the rock climber who is also listening to 3-hour podcasts, that in of itself is also breaking down the sociological aesthetic association of people who do philosophy being professors at colleges. Well, actually rock climbers can do it too. So that's another element of this that opens up possibility, where you can bring together the intellectual and the blue collar, the athlete and the asking questions. That's another thing that people can see that they're open to.
Yeah, no, I think that's all really good and important, because there's something quite like hopeful in all of that.
Yes.
And it's important, And I think that was great, like just how you addressed the aesthetic of the liminal web and people seeing it and all of that, because it is important, and it is quite a novel, historic moment for that.
Yes. And, well, without hope, you can't belong again. Mm-hmm. And basically the argument is belonging again is found in the capacity to make values for your own sake, which will require communities of people sustaining one another in that endeavor, of which would be communities of belonging, and that this belonging would be one of a logic and value outside the commodity capital form, AB, it would be dialectical, AB, and it would allow the emergence of an intrinsic motivation that would help us avoid the self-effacement of the great stagnation that is the result of a socioeconomic system that can only stimulate demand, not create demand, and will have higher well-being for it. Mm-hmm. Like, what could generate higher well-being could also generate higher wealth.
Yeah.
Like, we can get back to the age where wealth and well-being don't have to be separated.
Yeah.
We can actually get to where funny enough, wealth tends to be generated when there's greater well-being. That's what we're seeing. You stimulate wealth, stimulate demand by separating wealth and well-being. But if you want to create wealth, you create the conditions of the kind of subjects that enjoy the process of wealth creation. Mm-hmm. And guess what? When people enjoy making wealth, they make more of it. Mm-hmm. And so you get greater wealth and well-being together. Mm-hmm. But that all starts with people seeing communities in which people are learning for learning's sake and doing things for their own value, which then gives them permission to do it themselves.
Yep.
And in all of that, people can feel like they belong again.
Yes.
So please join us for the class. It will be starting on Sunday at Parallax. We're very glad to be part of it.
We're running through Sundays until the beginning of August. So there's offline tickets, online tickets. We hope you'll join us.
Yes, thank you so much.